Imagine being facing a full table, full of delicious dishes, but among all options, a specific food is totally forbidden for some of the world's largest religions. Why is the pig seen as unclean in Judaism and Islam, while Christians consume it without restrictions? Was it just an old rule, or is there a deeper meaning behind this ban? The truth is that this dietary restriction did not arise by chance. Since ancient times, the Holy Scriptures have established rigid rules on what may or may not be ingested, linking food directly to spiritual purity and obedience to God. But did these laws only have a religious purpose, or was there also a concern for hygiene and health? What's more, why did Christianity put this ban aside? Throughout this text, we will dive into the scriptures of the Torah, the Quran, and the Bible to understand the reasons behind this religious tradition. Let us explore from the ancient commandments, such as the writings in Leviticus 11:78 and Surah 2:173, to the changes brought by the New Testament, especially in the teachings of Jesus Christ and in the view of the Apostle Peter in Acts 10:13-15. Get ready to discover not only the historical and spiritual motives behind this practice, but also how food can become a powerful symbol of cultural identity and faith. In the end, you will have a new perspective on what it really means to follow these traditions and the impact they have to date on the modern world. Since the dawn of humanity, food has always been more than just a biological necessity. In many ancient civilizations, food rules served as a fundamental pillar to define who belonged to a particular religious group and who did not. The prohibition of consuming pork is a clear example of this, being a custom kept rigidly by Judaism and Islam, while Christianity adopted a different approach. But what led these religions to establish these distinct norms? In Judaism, food laws known as kosher were recorded in the Torah, outlining what is pure and unclean. In Islam, the concept of halal follows a similar principle, establishing rigid guidelines on what may or may not be consumed. Both traditions see food as something that does not only affect the body, but also the soul. Thus, avoiding the pig is not just a food choice, but a sign of obedience to God and a reinforcement of cultural identity. On the other hand, in Christianity, these dietary restrictions were gradually set aside. While the early Christian communities followed the Mosaic Law, the teachings of Jesus Christ brought a new perspective, emphasizing that spiritual purity does not come from what goes through the mouth, but from what comes out of the heart. This point was later reinforced by events such as the Apostle Peter's view in Acts 10:13-15, where God declares that no food should be considered unclean. Thus, we see that food has never been just about nutrition, it carries a deep symbolic and religious weight. But what was the original justification for these prohibitions? Was it just a matter of faith, or were practical reasons behind these rules? Let's explore this in the next topic. The prohibition of pork consumption in Judaism comes directly from the Old Testament scriptures, where God establishes specific guidelines on permitted and prohibited foods. In Leviticus 11:78, it is written that the pig is unclean because, although it has hull, it does not rum. This same commandment appears in Deuteronomy 14:21, reinforcing that touching the pork would be an act of impurity. For the ancient Israelites, following these laws was not just a food issue, but an act of obedience to God. In addition to the spiritual aspect, these rules also had a practical function. In the context of the Middle East, where these laws were recorded, pigs were considered impure animals not only in the religious but also sanitary sense. Unlike other breeding animals, pigs often live in dirty environments and have problematic eating habits. Thus, the laws of purity helped ensure not only food hygiene, but also the preservation of community health. For Jews, following kosher laws was not just a matter of avoiding disease, but a commitment to the tradition and identity of the people of Israel. The Torah does not directly explain the scientific motives behind the ban, but over the centuries, rabbis and scholars have come to interpret it as a way of keeping the people separate from foreign cultural practices. Thus, food restriction helped reinforce the cultural and spiritual identity of the Jews, making food a symbol of holiness. Even in modern times, kosher laws continue to be strictly followed by practicing Jews. The simple act of choosing a food becomes a way of expressing faith and connecting to the traditions of their ancestors. But was this prohibition just a matter of culture and religion, or was there a real concern for health? In the next topic, we will explore the impact of these practical and sanitary restrictions. Far beyond religious reasons, there is a practical justification for prohibiting pork consumption, especially in ancient times. Pigs were not only considered unclean spiritually, but they were also vectors of various diseases. One of the biggest dangers was trichinosis, a parasitic infection that can be transmitted by the consumption of undercooked pork. In a time without refrigeration or advanced preparation techniques, avoiding pig was an effective way to protect health from communities. In addition, the natural environment of the Middle East did not favor the creation of pigs. Unlike oxen and sheep, which offer milk, leather, and even work, pigs require large amounts of food and water without providing additional benefits beyond meat. In arid regions, where resources were limited, creating pigs was simply inefficient. Thus, avoiding the pig made sense not only to maintain food hygiene, but also to preserve essential resources for survival. Another important factor was the cultural perception of these animals. While sheep and oxen were seen as symbols of purity and sacrifice, pigs were often associated with filth and practices of foreign peoples. Many historians believe that this negative view of the pig may also have influenced its ban, reinforcing the separation between the followers of the Mosaic laws and the other peoples. Thus, avoiding consumption of pork was not only a matter of obedience to God, but also a strategy to maintain a distinct identity. Interestingly, as the world has evolved and medicine has advanced, many of the pig-related sanitary concerns could be controlled. However, the tradition of avoiding this flesh remained firm in Judaism and Islam. But if the sanitary and environmental reasons are no longer so relevant today, why did Christianity have decided to abandon this ban? Let's explore this change in the next topic. While Judaism and Islam maintained strict dietary restrictions, Christianity followed a different way. In the days of Jesus Christ, the Mosaic laws were still followed by the Jews, including the prohibition of the pig. However, in Mark 7:19, Jesus introduced a new view of spiritual purity, stating that what really makes a person impure is not what he eats, but what comes out of his heart. This statement marked a turning point in the way Christians came to see the food laws. For the Pharisees and masters of the law, who rigidly followed the traditions, this idea seemed revolutionary and even shocking. They believed that obedience to God was fulfilling the rules established in the Torah, including the prohibition of pork. But Jesus showed that true purity went beyond external restrictions and was linked to the individual's intentions and attitudes. This change of perspective paved the way for Christians to put aside the eating prohibitions of the Old Testament. Over time, this idea has solidified in Christian theology, especially after events such as the vision of the Apostle Peter, reported in Acts 10:13-15. In this passage, Peter sees a great towel coming down from heaven with various types of animals, and God says to him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." Faced with Peter's hesitation, which still followed the Jewish laws, God states, "Do not impurely what God purified." This moment symbolized the liberation of Christians from ancient food restrictions and reinforced the idea that faith was above the dietary rules. Thus, while Jews and Muslims maintained the prohibition of the pig as a pillar of their cultural and religious identity, Christians began to see food freedom as a reflection of their new covenant with God. But this change was not well received by all, and many primordial Christian communities still debated the role of Mosaic laws. After all, if Christians were free of these restrictions, why do some eating traditions still persist to this day? Let's see how this issue was received in the next topic. The Apostle Peter's view, narrated in Acts 10:13-15, was one of the most impactful events in the transition between Judaism and Christianity. In this passage, Peter has a vision in which he sees a great towel coming down from the sky, full of animals considered unclean by the Jewish laws. Then he hears a divine voice saying, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." Peter, surprised, replies that he has never eaten anything impure, but God insists, "Do not impurely what God has purified." This moment marked a reinterpretation of the old food laws. The meaning of this view went beyond the simple permission to eat pork. God was teaching that spiritual purity was no longer linked to food restrictions, but to the heart and faith of the individual. This revelation also served to prepare Peter for a crucial meeting with Cornelius, a Roman centurion who was not a Jew. Until that moment, the followers of Jesus still saw the Gentiles as unclean, and vision helped Peter understand that the message of Christ was for all, not just to the Jews. This episode had a huge impact on the development of Christianity. Peter's view reinforced the idea that the Mosaic Law, including its dietary restrictions, was no longer mandatory for Christians. This paved the way for Christianity to expand among the Gentile peoples who did not follow the same dietary rules as the Jews. As a result, the prohibition of pork and other eating norms were gradually abandoned in Christian communities. However, this change did not happen without resistance. Many Jews converted to Christianity still followed the laws of the Torah and had difficulty accepting this new food freedom. The debate on the role of the Mosaic Law continued for a long time among the early Christians. But if in Christianity the food rules were relaxed, why in Islam they remained so rigid? In the next topic, we will see how the pork ban remains a central pillar in the Islamic faith. Unlike Christianity, Islam maintained the prohibition of pig as a sacred and unquestionable rule. The Quran is explicit in declaring this meat as haram, that is, forbidden to Muslims. In Surah 2:173, it is written, "He has forbidden you only the dead animal flesh, the blood, the pork, and all that has been sacrificed to another other than Allah." This rule was not created by Muslims, but confirmed as part of the continuity of food purity traditions already found in Judaism. For Muslims, avoiding pig is not just a matter of hygiene or health, but an act of obedience to God. In Islam, faith is not based solely on the logical understanding of prohibitions, but on the complete acceptance of Allah's will. Even though scientific advances have allowed safer pork, this ban continues to be strictly followed. After all, Islamic faith teaches that divine orders do not depend on human explanations, but on the total submission to the will of the Creator. In addition, the prohibition of the pig reinforces the cultural and religious identity of Muslims. In a world where many foods are consumed indiscriminately, follow the rules of halal which go beyond the prohibition of pork and include the way animals should be slaughtered becomes a symbol of commitment to faith. Avoiding this flesh is not just a detail of the diet, but a way of demonstrating dedication and separation of external influences that can compromise spirituality. Despite the prohibition, Islam recognizes the importance of divine mercy. In extreme situations, where there is no other food option available, the Quran himself allows a Muslim to eat pork to survive without being considered a sin. This shows that although the rules are rigid, Islam also values compassion and the preservation of life. But beyond obedience, there is another reason why Muslims follow this restriction: the role of spiritual discipline. Let's understand this in the next topic. In Islam, following eating rules is not just a habit, but an exercise of spiritual discipline. The prohibition of pork, as well as other halal restrictions, reinforces the idea that the true believer must demonstrate his devotion in all aspects of life, including what he eats. It is not just a matter of avoiding food, but a daily commitment to obedience to Allah, placing faith above the desires and conveniences of the material world. For Muslims, this food discipline acts as a constant reminder that earthly life is fleeting and that the true purpose is to follow divine teachings. By saying no to the pig and other forbidden foods, the believer strengthens his self-discipline, an essential concept in Islamic faith. This same principle is reflected in the fasting of Ramadan, where food restriction is not only for purifying the body, but especially to strengthen the soul and connection to Allah. In addition, halal food creates a collective religious identity. By sharing meals within allowed standards, Muslims reinforce community ties and strengthen the sense of belonging to a group that follows sacred laws. Just as Jews use the kosher diet to preserve their cultural identity, Muslims find a pillar of their faith in their diet. In a globalized world, where various external influences can affect religiosity, these rules help maintain the purity of customs. This daily commitment to halal rules shows how Islamic faith is not limited to prayers and rituals, but manifests itself in every daily choice. For a Muslim, following these food laws is not an arbitrary restriction, but a way to approach God and live according to the principles of the Quran. But what about Judaism? Does the prohibition of pork has a similar role among Jews? Let's explore this in the next topic. In Judaism, following kosher food laws is one of the pillars of faith, and the prohibition of pork is one of the best-known rules. These guidelines come directly from the Torah, where God establishes which foods are allowed and which are unclean. As mentioned in Leviticus 11:78 and Deuteronomy 14:21, the pig does not meet the criteria of purity, as it has a bound hull but not rumen. Thus, its consumption is prohibited, and even touching the pork could cause spiritual impurity. The practice of maintaining a kosher diet goes far beyond simple food choices. It is an act of obedience to God. For the practicing Jews, each meal becomes a way of honoring the divine commandments and reinforcing the cultural identity of the people of Israel. More than a restriction, this diet creates a daily connection with faith, reminding the Jews that following the laws of the Torah is a commitment that involves every aspect of life. In addition to the prohibition of pork, the kosher law brings other specific rules, such as the separation between meat and dairy and the ritualistic slaughter of animals. All of this has a spiritual purpose and, in some cases, even sanitary. The idea of food hygiene has always been present in these laws, and many scholars believe that food restrictions have helped protect Jews against illness in ancient times. However, the main focus has always been holiness and spiritual purity. Following the kosher diet is not imposed on fear or obligation, but a symbol of belonging and faith. Even today, Jews around the world continue to maintain this tradition, even when it requires extra effort. But while Judaism and Islam see eating as a reflection of spirituality, Christianity adopted a different approach. How do these differences impact the religious identity of each group? Let's explore this in the next topic. Food has always been one of the main markers of cultural and religious identity, and restrictions on pork consumption reflect this clearly. For Jews and Muslims, following food rules is not just a matter of health or tradition, but a way of distinguishing itself from other peoples and reaffirming their obedience to God. These laws serve as a constant reminder that faith must be lived in every detail of everyday life, including eating choices. Judaism sees the kosher diet as a symbol of belonging to the people of Israel. Since biblical times, obedience to dietary laws helped Jews maintain their identity, especially when they were in contact with other cultures. Even during the diaspora, when the Jews were scattered around the world, keeping the kosher traditions helped them preserve their faith and avoid complete assimilation. Eating differently from other peoples was a way of saying, "We follow the laws of God." In Islam, the prohibition of the pig and the halal rules create a community united by faith. In a world where Muslims live in various parts of the planet, maintaining these traditions helps reinforce religious ties and ensure that Islamic values are preserved. The commitment to halal diet is seen as a test of devotion, showing that believers put Allah's commandments above the temptations and conveniences of modern life. Meanwhile, Christianity followed another way. By giving up the Old Testament food restrictions, Christians emphasized spiritual freedom about external laws. For Christians, faith is not defined by what one eats, but by what is believed and practiced. However, this change also led to a disconnection between food and spirituality, something that remains a big difference between the three religions. But how do these distinct views affect the way each faith faces its traditions? Let's understand this in the next topic. By comparing the three great monotheistic religions, it is clear that each has developed a distinct relationship with food laws. Jews and Muslims see the prohibition of pork as an unchanging divine order, a test of obedience to God, and a symbol of spiritual purity. Christianity, on the other hand, interpreted these laws differently, placing faith above dietary restrictions. But what motivated this divergence of paths? In Judaism, the kosher rules are a fundamental part of the Mosaic Law, established in the Torah and maintained for thousands of years. Eating according to these laws is a way of demonstrating fidelity to the divine commandments and reinforcing the cultural identity of the Jewish people. In Islam, the prohibition of pork comes from the Quran Surah 2:173 and is part of the rules of halal, which guide Muslims to consume halal and pure foods, always in submission to Allah's will. Christianity, in turn, broke with these restrictions. Jesus Christ, in Mark 7:19, taught that true impurity comes from the heart, not from food. Later, the Apostle Peter's vision in Acts 10:13-15 reinforced this idea, freeing Christians from the eating rules of the Old Testament. Thus, food was seen as neutral, without influence on spirituality. For Christians, this freedom reflects the new covenant with God, based on faith rather than traditions. Despite differences, all these approaches show how food is a reflection of the relationship of each faith with the divine. While some see eating rules as a way of disciplining the soul, others see them as a barrier that has been overcome over time. In the end, the The way each religion deals with pork consumption says a lot about its values and principles. But what about you? How do you see these traditions and the impact they have to this day? Throughout this text, we have seen that the prohibition of pig in Judaism and Islam is not just a food rule, but a deep reflection of faith, cultural identity, and spiritual discipline. For Jews and Muslims, following these laws goes beyond nutrition. It is a commitment to God, a demonstration of faithfulness to Scripture, and a link that has joined their communities for centuries. On the other hand, in Christianity, the approach is different. Jesus Christ's vision in Mark 7:19 and the Apostle Peter's experience in Acts 10:13-15 showed that the Old Testament's food laws were reinterpreted, allowing Christians to see faith beyond dietary restrictions. For them, true purity is in the heart and in actions, not what is placed at the table. Each of these perspectives reveals something essential about the relationship of religions with spirituality and tradition. While some find holiness in strict obedience to laws, others see freedom in breaking these rules. But in the end, the big question remains: to what extent does our diet reflect our values and beliefs? Does what we eat really influence our connection with the divine, or is this just a cultural construction? Now, I invite you to reflect on what you learned here. How do these different religious visions impact the world today? If you want to keep exploring topics like this, be sure to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so as not to lose any content.